$300.
Good evening. My name is Mohammed Hashim, and I'm the Canadian Race Relations Foundation's Executive Director. Before I begin, I like to be before we start the program, I like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we are gathered, which is Mississauga in the province of Ontario and the region of Peel, uh, and is part of treaty lands and the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for this land. In particular, we acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Ojibwe, the Chippewa peoples, the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I am grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabitants. As we start to kick off this evening, I want to first start with a traditional opening. And for that, I'd like to invite Mr. James Shwauna of the Waquimakong Unceded Territory. James.
Ani, mino naksham gat kinoya. Mi glitch kinabish aikmant pinanga, we warm the mikmanda. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for coming to view this program. I'm going to say an opening in Anishinaabe language. Like you said, I am from Waquimakong Unceded Indian Reservation, number 26. That's where Mishe Benjamin, that's where I'm from. So I'm going to do the opening. I'm going to say, Miigwech mishomis, ogibi wasaji nunga. Miigwech ni kitnunga gijigok. Wene chiknoa mukni chipimadis mina wene chiknonak. Miigwech gish kakamikwe, ogimishang matzuin, ogimishang bish, ogimishang wesiek, ogimishang mijim, minwa, ogimishang nesewin. Sema nibigitna, wabnung, jaunung, epingishmak, minwa giwetnung. Natamoshin jemupshko gabwea, minata zongdea, miigwech mishomis. That is, it's not a prayer, but it's more like a thanksgiving, miigwech, to say miigwech. And in there, I say, thank you, Grandfather Son, for shining on us today. I say, upon this day, to help me look at my fellow human and to talk to my fellow life in a good way. And thank you to Medicine Plant Woman for giving us life, for giving us water, for giving us animals, for giving us food, and for giving us the air that we breathe. And I also say in that same, I say, I offer my tobacco east, south, west, and north. And it closes off by saying, help me to be able to stand strong and to have a strong heart. Thank you, Grandfather. That's his translation to that opening I just did. No, miigwech, thank you.
First, Manulife for being able to provide the resources to have this event today. Your partnership is deeply appreciated, and we've really enjoyed working with Manulife for all the work and their commitment they've had towards building a greater inclusive Canada. Thank you, Manulife. So I had prepared a number of remarks in advance of today, and then when I saw the interview of Colton Boucher's mom, it reminded me of where Sean Vanderklees and I met. 17 years ago, Sean and I used to work for an organization called Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And part of what our job was at the time was to express and tell people from all faiths and backgrounds the impact of impaired driving, and what families felt after the loss of in such a tragic moment. So we would sit with mothers who would tell us their pain and to share those moments and to be able to have people understand the difficulty of what it is to lose a child. And when I saw Colton's mom the other day, it it struck me very deeply because I couldn't imagine, the pain that she's gone through to be able to see her son killed that way, then being farmed that way, and having to just see her in front of a microphone with the incredible courage that she demonstrated was really something to be inspired. And I want to acknowledge her, her family, and all those who are standing for justice. For far too long, Canada has not done enough for reconciliation. As somebody who was born here, but I know my parents came here as immigrants, I take full responsibility for what this nation has done to Indigenous communities, and to the first inhabitants of this land. And it's upon all of us to be able to do the right thing and to work to make sure that this country, this nation, these many nations that exist on this land live in harmony and are given the full respect that they deserve. Today's conversation is an important one because we're diving deep into what's that which is really mattering to many people within the communities. And it's important for us to be able to hear from precisely those who are impacted the most, those who are on the front lines of justice, who are fighting, who are protesting, who are raising their voices, who are making sure that we all understand both the pain, the suffering, but the need for there to be justice provided. And I just want to thank One Dish, One Mic for the incredible opportunity to partner with you. I'm happy to do so now before Sean becomes this big media personality, and he's a bit harder to get a hold of once he's off to the CBC and doing bigger and grander things. But it's been an honor to be able to work with you, to share the space with you. And I hope that from today, we learn from each other, hear each other, and recommit ourselves to building a better and more inclusive society. Sean, I'll kick it over to you.
Thank you so much, Mo. I do appreciate those kind words. I can't believe that it's been 17 years. That ages me so much. I don't like the sounds of that, but again, thank you for all the good work that you're doing. Thank you for taking the helm and the leadership role at the Canadian Race Relations Foundations. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're live. One Dish, One Mic is on the air, and today we have a lineup for you. We are bringing in some of the who's who of people who are working on the front lines and who are making that impact that we need, that Indigenous people need. The program that you're featuring, that you're tuning into, is called On the Front Lines of Justice. So if there is anybody who managed to make it into the back room and you're getting the privilege of seeing all of the behind the scenes comments, if you could please make the decision to click on one of those links and view this broadcast from our Facebook. What we have today is we have three speakers who are going to be opening up their hearts to you. Three speakers who are intertwined with the topics that we have chosen to address. And those topics are anti-Indigenous racism, they're the land back movement, and they're the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement. And given that these topics are so heavy and so hard to carry, the baggage that often goes with them is so hard to carry. Should you want to ask a question, we encourage you to do so, but just be mindful of the questions that you are asking. We do understand that this is being broadcasted live on the internet. It's being broadcasted on the One Dish One Mic Facebook page. It's being broadcasted on the Canadian Race Relations Facebook page, so on and so forth. But be as mindful as possible. What we're going to do is we're going to bring up each speaker for about 10 minutes. We're going to get a quick overview of their topic. From there, we're going to have a panel discussion. So there's predetermined questions that have been selected. We will interview all the panelists in a group setting. And the last 15 to 30 minutes is going to be dedicated to questions from the audience. So again, if you have those questions, you want to speak to Skylar, you want to speak to Francis, you want to speak to Fallon, feel free to ask those questions. If you have any questions right now, feel free to type them in. This is being monitored on all streams, so it doesn't matter where you're viewing this video. Your question will be seen by the person who's working the mics behind the scenes. So without further ado, I am going to bring on the one and only Francis Moore. Francis is a Anishinaabe from Temiskaming First Nation who has been living in London for 15 years. Francis is passionate about Indigenous rights, issues, politics, and just general social justice. Drawing on her legal background from Georgian College, she has over 9 years of experience in the not-for-profit sector, advocating for diversity, equity and inclusion, and employment through relationship building and program management. Francis, my friend, how are you?
Anine, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I cannot complain. It is a heck of a way to spend a Thursday night live broadcasting on Facebook. Again, that's the One Dish One Mic Facebook, as well as the Canadian Race Relations Facebook. And we had you on the show a little while ago, and we wanted to talk to you about the fantastic work that you're doing. And we wanted to focus the conversation more so on just an overview of anti-Indigenous racism. What does that mean? It seems to be a new topic, a new term that exists now in society that we're seeing a lot of.
Yeah. So the textbook answer to that is that anti-Indigenous racism is the ongoing race-based discrimination, negative stereotyping, and injustice experienced by Indigenous peoples. It includes ideas and practices that establish, maintain, and perpetuate power imbalances, systemic barriers, and inequitable outcomes that stem from the legacy of colonial policies and practices in this country. So systemic anti-Indigenous racism is evident in a variety of ways, but mostly in the discriminatory federal policies such as the Indian Act and the residential school system. It also manifests in the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in provincial criminal justice and child welfare systems, as well as inequitable outcomes in education, well-being, and health. Individual lived experiences of anti-Indigenous racism can really be seen on the rise in acts of hostility and violence directed at Indigenous peoples. And let's be clear, when I say systemic racism, it doesn't mean that there's lots of racism in the system. It means that even if there was zero racists, that the system would still disproportionately harm people of certain races. And I want to clarify, because that's one thing that I've noticed over the years in doing this work is a lot of folks, even those that are incredibly educated, don't quite understand that particular concept. You know, a couple weeks ago, I had a tweet blew up across multiple platforms. It was shared to Facebook. It was shared to Instagram and even Tumblr. And it said, "I no longer want to be commended on my resiliency. I want to see the systems redesigned so that there's not a need to be resilient. And I think collectively, we really need to think about that. Obviously, some resiliency is needed in our day-to-day. However, we're often commended for being resilient in the face of things like racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, all the rest of the phobias and isms. But why aren't those systems adapting? Why do we allow folks to continually be harmed without saying, hey, what can we do here? And it's funny because we often see these heartwarming stories shared on social media that are really temporary and small scale responses to systematic failures. And I wish as a society, rather, we would find it just as inspirational to make structural and systemic changes to those unjust systems. But I'm not sure if Western society really knows how to tell those stories yet, but we do as Indigenous folks.
So if we are the people who know how to tell these stories, how do you suggest that we best get these out? Because I mean, from a historical standpoint, we've been telling these stories, we've been saying the same thing since time immemorial, since 1492 Land Back Land. We scream, "Don't kill us." We scream, "Let us have our land." We scream, let us fish for the food that we want to eat and hunt for the food that we want to eat." How do we get that across?
I think it's multifaceted. I think a lot of the work that I do is humanizing Indigenous folks. So many Canadians, both those that have been here for generations or immigrants and newcomers, have been fed so much information or misinformation about Indigenous folks and truly really have no idea who we are as peoples and the issues that we face daily. So much of the education we've all received, even myself, about Indigenous folks is incredibly biased and in some cases completely incorrect. Much of what we've learned is whitewashed because it is largely written by the dominant society, thereby perpetuating the privilege and views that they had at the time. And with that in mind, you have to remember that ultimately what folks know of history is that dominant culture's justifications for its actions. That doesn't mean that it's factually accurate or the truth. Many of us have endured history classes in which Indigenous folks were referred to in the past tense. Myself, I was one of those individuals where my history teacher was talking and, saying, oh, this is the way that they live. They, don't exist anymore. And I was sitting right there in the classroom. I think things like smallpox blankets, the Indian Act, treaties, reservations, the pass system, and residential schools largely weren't taught up until recently. And now we're just really kind of starting to dig into that, coupled with stereotypes that we see in the media, news, television, movies. Many folks are really just starting to learn, unlearn, and relearn. And the answer is education, but it's education coupled with action. I think there's many folks who are just starting to do this work, and it's important to give them the tools so they aren't stuck in what's commonly referred to as the cycle of inaction. And for those that aren't aware of this concept, it starts with some sort of horrific inaction. It moves into shock and confusion, then some sort of big emotional response. And then sadly, it moves into performative allyship, guilt and fatigue, inaction, passivity, and ultimately apathy before it restarts the system. So I think it's important to say that up until now, it's not been your fault, but from here on out, it's a choice. It's absolutely 110% a choice. Learning, unlearning, and relearning takes strength and courage, and it's much harder than holding on to false and outdated or just plain wrong knowledge. It's not easy work. It's not work that starts and ends in a day with one workshop or one seminar. It's an ongoing journey that will require, continued effort, far too often folks aim to be that perfect ally. And I want to dispel that right now and say there's no such thing. You will mess up. I think it's important to recognize that, BIPOC folk, we aren't perfect. We've just been at it longer for the most part. And we have skin in the game, so to speak. So, for us, it's a little bit different. And some of those tools that I've mentioned come into place. It's like, how are you being called in or being called out? How are you ensuring that you're not centering yourself or your feelings in those conversations? Do you know how to have a conversation without being defensive? Many times folks have a large problem with being called racist, more so than the racism itself. And we have to sit on that for a moment and what that really means. Do you tone police individuals when they're countering your opinions or sharing their experiences? Are you inadvertently playing into that angry Indigenous woman trope? I think it's important to note that if a house is on fire, we don't tell people to be nicer or quieter or what words they're allowed to yell. The same applies here. Many times folks are uncomfortable, and I don't want you to be comfortable. My experiences as an Anishinaabe are not comfortable. I shouldn't have to downplay them for your benefit. But challenging perspectives, opinions, morals, belief systems, and truly reflecting on ways that folks have perpetuated, colonialism or anti-Indigenous racism is going to require folks to really lean into that discomfort. And there isn't room for distracting from the conversation at hand, deflecting, or something that I've seen quite often is ultimately blaming those experiencing the racism for the racism itself because they've called it out.
Well, I really thank you for your time. It's been a quick 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is going to say goodbye to you for now. I'm going to continue this conversation in approximately 20 minutes, and we're going to bring on Skylar Williams. So, ladies and gentlemen, Frances Elizabeth Moore will be back in about 20 minutes to answer any questions. So if you have any questions about anti-Indigenous racism, feel free to put them in the live stream that you're seeing on the Facebook page of One Dish, One Mic and the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Skylar, my friend, are you there? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, brother. Good to see you again.
That is fantastic. It appears as if you are in a place that resembles
1492 Landback Lane.
And how's that going, my friend?
Oh, it's going all right. This is one of the buildings that we've constructed here on site, and so it is, one of what are we at now? 12 buildings that we've been able to either construct on site or have delivered to site for. There's some tiny homes here, and so since July 19th we've been here 8 months and a bit. So it's been a little bit.
So we were coming up with a name on the front lines of justice. I can't think of anybody more applicable to where that name applies, because you're literally standing on land that you are attempting to reclaim. And that brings up the whole concept of this land back movement that seems to really take in social media by fire. If you could explain to our viewers, what is the land back movement?
Well, I mean, here in Six Nations, it is a kind of taking back of our rights around our lands and our connection to it. I think for many Indigenous people, and I think we do our very best to show our Western brothers and sisters exactly what that means around and explain that, and educate as much as we can about what that means to have that connection to the land, and how that intrinsic connection that we have to these lands, and how much when we hear those stories of our creation, and how when Sky Woman fell, like this clay that we're standing on is what we are made of, what our bodies were made of during creation. And so I think that part of this is something that really, binds us quite directly to to the land and the clay that we're standing on, that we're fighting for, that we've been willing to, go through the rubber bullets flying past our ears to see our brothers and sisters dragged from our lands, to see people tasered, and myself being able to pull the taser darts from one of my brother's backs as the police tried to arrest him. This is that racism that we were just talking about. Like, this is how it plays out in real time. This is what it looks like to have, those rubber bullets blowing up against cars beside you, and scattering your body with these little bits of rubber that feel like little bee stings.
No, I've heard you often say the term that you have to make an excuse, or you have to defend the land, because if you don't defend the land, what are you going to say to your children? What are you going to say to your grandchildren? Can you speak to that a little bit for me?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, this is, our ancestors, our grandfathers, great grandfathers, and mothers, they fought and died for these lands. Like, what kind of disrespect would that show to those people? Like, because every square inch of this of our territory that we have was paid for in the blood of our ancestors. And so what am I going to tell my grandkids, one day when they ask, how come we don't have any land left? How come we don't even have an argument left to be made for the land? Everybody talks about how important the land is to us, but as far as we can tell, it has, been developed. And, whether we're talking about here where it's, for housing, because like for here, it's Southern Ontario. This is, a quarter of the entire country lives in Southern Ontario. And so, like, whether that's in politics and in legislation, where, in the past it was the Brits, advertising in England for, for people to come fight in the War of 1812 and come settle this wild country. Or if it's today with the, Places to Grow Act and the Planning Act that is enticing and incentivizing development of our lands. Like, this is what we need to be able to give to our children, at the very least, to be able to have an argument, to be able to say, no, these are our lands. Because, for the last 8 months plus, we've maintained this as a peaceful occupation of our lands. And, sorry, go ahead.
No, my apologies. I didn't mean to cut you off.
And so the idea that we aren't going to be, evicting people going up and down the Grand River trying to say, hey, all you white people, get off our lands. That's not what we're saying. A lot of those people, their families have been here for 100, 200 years. And, like that piece of this is just saying, we want the same ability that every, big city, whether you're a big city, small town, like, you've all grown exponentially over the last 150 years. The only places in this country that have gotten smaller in those last 150 years are reserves. And so we want to give to our children and our grandchildren that ability. The same one that every other community and every other city has across this country is that ability to grow and thrive. And so if we can give them at least an argument in that line of thinking, then we've accomplished something.
Now, one of the biggest criticisms that the land back movement has received and continues to receive is why do you have to do it in this manner? Why are you taking the land back physically? Why is this the only way forward?
Well, this is being done because there has been, when we went to the civil case, we've done everything we possibly could to push that forward. That, we didn't want to have to resort to this. But even in our civil case and the injunction here, the court said that, I was barred from any participation in my own defense there. I was every bit of evidence that we put forward was struck from the record, so that we couldn't even put in any history of the land that belongs to us. And so if we're gonna look back further, we've done everything we possibly could over the last 150, 200 years to advocate for, to petition to government, to protest, to do this in every possible means to not have to be trust me, if there was an easier, softer way, I wouldn't be in the middle of this field in the middle of spring when there's not a blade of grass, not a tree, not a shrub left from after the bulldozers of the developer came through here.
Well, I thank you for that. I really do appreciate your time. We're going to be back with you in about 15 minutes. So if you could hold on at 1492 Landback Lane, and we'll turn to you shortly, okay?
Yep.
Perfect. We're going to bring up Fallon Farinacci next. Fallon, my good friend. I've had the privilege of hearing Fallon speak on numerous occasions, and Fallon's story is one of the most heart-wrenching stories that a person could hear. We're talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and Fallon has a direct connection to that. Bear with me for 1 second. Fallon is a proud Red River Métis. She's a survivor and advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2 SLGBTQIA people. In 2017, Fallon testified in a national inquiry for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, sharing her story of loss and trauma. In 2019, Fallon joined the National Family Advisory Circle, where she works closely with other MMIW family members and NAFC staff and commissioners for the National Inquiry. Over the past couple of years, Fallon has sat on several advisory boards, dedicating her time to bringing awareness to missing and murdered Indigenous women across Turtle Island. Fallon, welcome on. Welcome to the show. Is this a show? I'm not sure what this is, but welcome. Thank you for the time. Thank you for agreeing to come on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I could not say no after joining you before. And as it was mentioned before, I mean, I might as well get on with you now before you're off and I don't see you anymore.
Yeah, I don't know how accurate of a description that is from my good friend Mo, but I do appreciate the sentiment. So missing and murdered Indigenous women, I mean, that's a tough subject to talk about. It's a tough subject to listen to. So I can't imagine some of the hardships and some of the trauma that goes through that you have to deal with when discussing this process.
Yeah. So you mentioned, for me personally, for anyone obviously that's on here that doesn't know my personal story, I grew up in Manitoba. And at the age of 9, myself and my brothers were held hostage along with my parents. And we waited for 6 hours for the RCMP to come in from the original phone call that went in at 2:30 in the morning. And they didn't come into our house until 8:30 in the morning. And at that time, the man who had taken our family hostage, who was well known to our family and our community, had killed both my parents, and my older brother had escaped. And so, yeah, it's very close. I myself did not have any idea that I was impacted by MMIW. Even throughout my process of going along with the inquiry, I was genuinely in it to create any type of change that I could. And it wasn't really until the closing ceremonies that it hit me, like at the very end, that I was the survivor of it. The system had failed me as a young girl, my brothers as well, my parents as well. The man who came into our home, my parents actually had a restraining order against him. My mother had actually told the RCMP not once but twice that she believed he had a .22 caliber rifle, and on another occasion she also told them that he had a revolver, and then he threatened her as well that he would kill my mother and that she wouldn't live to see her next birthday. In January 93, he made good on his promise, and he actually used the exact weapon that she told the RCMP that he had in his possession. And then he turned the gun on himself and committed suicide. And then eventually, 2 hours after he and my parents had passed, that's when the RCMP came in to take myself, 9 at the time, and my brother, my younger brother, was 5 at the time, out of our home. So in 2017, when it came up, my cousin had brought it to my attention that my parents' case was named. And so I said, yeah, I would do anything I could to bring any kind of change. And it wasn't until I went through the process that I realized, I thought I knew I was affected by it, but I didn't realize how much. Like, as you mentioned, when I talk about it, things that come up, because again, my family actually never received, my brothers or I never received proper post-traumatic care. That was not something that was offered to us. And then I was displaced from my community. And so I grew up in Ontario, near Sean, and I wasn't around my community and my father's side of the family. I eventually fought and made my way back so that I could be with that side of the family. And now I get to my family's grown. I get to visit and have loved ones across Canada. So I can find the good with the amount of love that I'm surrounded with.
Now that again, like your whole experience, I've heard the story being told several times. I've had the pleasure of listening to you speak. My apologies and my condolences to you and to yours. When the national inquiry came about in 2017, 2018, what was your first thoughts to it? There was a change in government at that time, right? The previous government, under the leadership of Stephen Harper, maintained the fact that anytime a Indigenous woman was to be killed, murdered, or declared missing, it was more of a one-off situation, that there was no connection between these deaths at all. And it was just for lack of better terms, it was just psychopaths going on and killing these people. Under Prime Minister Trudeau, he said, no, we're going to launch the inquiry, and it has since been completed. What are your thoughts about the whole process that has surrounded this?
Right. So the national inquiry, there's hope, right? Because you have that hope of this coming on. There's a lot of families I totally understand were and maybe still are against the fact that it happened. There was a lot of reliving of trauma for families, and I'm never going to speak on behalf of other people because that's not my place, my story. For me, it was one of those things, like, I was looking at it, if this can create change, then I'm in for this. If we can bring attention to it, because, like, I can't even tell you how many people had no idea close to me, even after I had testified. Like, I'm at the closing ceremonies, and there were numerous people who didn't know what it is. And that's not for them to be shameful of. It's also just to show you how much people are left in the dark about the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. And then to speak to, what you said about our previous Prime Minister saying how it was like a one-off situation. To give you an idea, the week that my parents were killed, there was 2 other women who were killed by their stalkers at the exact same time. And also, the man who killed my parents, he was Indigenous as well. And so I will say, like, there's so much to be looked at as to, like, his mental health, what was going on in his life. People get really confused when I think of this, and it took me a really long time to even understand, like, this is affecting so many Indigenous peoples in our country, and yet it's not even like this needs to be at the forefront. You know, Indigenous women are 16 times more likely to be killed than non-Indigenous women in this country, to be killed or go missing. And so that's, you know, we have to stand and say that's not okay.
And I think you've done a fantastic job doing so. I mean, again, the weight of the topic that we're talking about is tremendous, and I don't think most people who are watching can appreciate how heavy that is unless they have some sort of direct connection to the subject at hand.
Sorry, I also should say, like, how the ending of it right now, I will say, how you asked me, I didn't even answer that part about Justin Trudeau. Well, now it's been sitting. We're going on 2 years. He's done nothing. His government has done nothing. Number one for the 231 calls for justice is to implement them. That's number one on the list. It's not been done. And so, you know, I mean, within there you have water as well, and we've already surpassed his promise. So I can see and understand now, being in it, going through the process, the frustration that families, and that's, you know, I'm using the word frustration as like a very small word, as their feelings around this, and the lack of action. It's time. Like, I don't even know, you know, change has to come, and that those calls for justice need to be implemented. People need to understand, Canadians, I say this all the time, like, families gathered, they testified, they re-traumatized themselves to put those calls for justice out there. So for our government to do nothing about it is like saying, the fact that you shared your story, Fallon, and like, I'm gonna, for myself, I shared my story. I said everything that I went through and that I saw as a 9-year-old girl, a child. They're saying it to the child. They're not saying it to me. It doesn't matter. We're not going to put these calls for justice out there and implement them.
I mean, that must be so frustrating. Given how traumatizing and how heavy the weight is of the subject at hand. We are going to bring in our next two, or not our next two. We're going to bring back in Skylar Williams and Frances Moore. We're going to have just a general discussion on issues that are affecting Indigenous people. So, my friends, welcome back. Thank you. First and foremost, I want to thank you all for sharing your stories. These stories aren't light. These are stories that affect how we, as Indigenous people, participate in this country that is Canada. Right? When people often make the decision on how they're going to vote, that decision, that from our perspective, is, are we going to be treated fairly as a people? Will we experience racism? Are we more likely to experience racism under said government? Is the government that's running for election going to address the issues of murdered and missing Indigenous women? And then for Skylar too, what are you doing about Land Back Lane? The fact of the matter is, we've been taking the Canadian government to court for hundreds of years, and the process to get a land claim heard by the Supreme Court of Canada is around 30 years. What are you doing? Right? So this is what we as Indigenous people have to consider. My first question that I want to throw to everybody is, have you seen some progress in the last 50 or so years? So let's think back to the golden age of the Indigenous rights movement, or what was often described as the golden age of the Indigenous rights movements in the 1970s with the American Indian movement, and then now the National Brotherhood in Canada. Has there been some change, Frances?
I definitely think so. I think that when it comes to progress, we're seeing it in small little steps, but in many cases, I feel like we go 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And a lot of that has to do, like I said before, with the misunderstanding about who we are as peoples and what it is that we may want, and the motives behind why why we're trying to push some of these things forward. I think definitely in the last decade with social media, we're reaching a lot more people. But with that, the flip side of the coin is we're experiencing a lot more hate. I think, you can open any article about Indigenous folks and you can see exactly what the country thinks about us. Over the last couple of years, I've read, when the blockades happened, we should have been hit by trains. I've been, wished death upon. I've been told that I should be raped into submission. All of these kind of things, just simply because we are using our voices. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that Canada is really ready to hear them. I'm hoping that, conversations like this, that, with the pandemic, it's certainly made a lot more opportunity for folks to take a back seat and do some learning. I've done quite a few different sessions with, business leaders, with businesses themselves, with youth as well. And I would like to say that I'm optimistic, but I think I'm going to say I'm cautiously optimistic. I would love to see change. I would love for it to happen overnight so that, my son, my niece, my nephews, they don't have to have the same conversations that I've been having since I was, old enough to have the conversations, which has been, almost 20 years now. We have the same conversations over and over again, and it's time that we move on to new conversations and we see some actual progress.
How about for you, Skylar? I mean, your involvement in the land back movement goes back, as my earliest recollection is 2006 with Ganestado. And land back movements traditionally take a while, right? I mean, if we were to do everything through the court process, we're looking at a 30-year time frame. So I guess in your short life that you've lived fantastically so far, have you noticed any change?
I think that the governments have been saying all the right things, all the pretty words that, Indigenous people, that got Justin Trudeau elected. Indigenous people came out to vote in such a huge way the last election that elected Justin Trudeau, on all of these promises about nation to nation, about all of these big happy words that made a lot of Indigenous people feel like there was a chance. And I think that bit of that I think both of our speakers, Fallon and Farron and Francis, have both touched on was, just not feeling as if they're going quite far enough. I mean, how can we, be talking about UNDRIP in the federal government right now, be talking about UNDRIP when, the only bit of consent or consultation that has ever happened here at Land Back Lane came from a guy with a gun on his hip from the OPP. Like, this is something that, affects all of our communities over and over and over again. And we're talking about up north with the community telling the OPP to get off their territory. Or we're talking about out east with the Mi'kmaq fishers not having any kind of means to assert their rights that I think the RCMP knows is law, but they have no protection against the fishers, the white settler fishers that are there brutalizing their companies and their boats and their fishers. You want to go out west and see the Sequemic and Wet'suwet'en, it's the same thing over and over again. And I think continuing that narrative of, us having to be the good little Indian in order to have our rights. We have to be that good little Indian if we want to be able to have a voice at the table. And you know what? I think our communities have shown over and over again that we are willing to have that peace. We would love nothing more than for there to be some peaceful resolution, certainly when it comes to land claims issues. And I mean, we've extended that hand of of peace and of friendship with our, with the federal government and with the provincial government, to say, like, let's sit down, like, we are willing to discuss this, but you need to understand that we've never surrendered the rights to these lands.
Thank you for that, Skylar. I mean, that remains unequivocally true, is that the rights have yet to be surrendered, and they never will be surrendered, right? For Fallon, same thing. Has there been any progress? I mean, I think it's fair to say that there has been a dramatic change from Stephen Harper to Justin Trudeau, but is it good enough?
No, like I said, it's not, because now I'm living through this whole process with that government. So for me, coming into it with that government and going through the inquiry and not, you had hope. It's almost, it was worse going through it that way, given that hope that we're going to come out of it with something at the closing ceremonies, that feeling of handing over the calls for justice, and in the same day realizing, oh my gosh, this wasn't just my family story, it directly impacted me as well. And so, wanting that change for the next generation as well. I'm a mom. I have a 2 boys and a daughter, and for me, I think now it's my job is just to ensure that something does come from it, change does come for them, and like, that can't be a 3rd generation for our family of that trauma being relived. And again, because of the government, like, for the calls for justice, for me specifically, my family, had they been implemented already, I'm looking at about 20 that could have impacted either like now and prior. That's a lot in just 231. It's a big number to some people, but like, that's day-to-day life for Indigenous people in this country. And those calls for justice also, like, for people to know, they're not just for, and not to say just for, but like, it's for all Indigenous communities. You know what I mean? Everyone in the Indigenous community as well. And mostly for Canadians, right? Those are there for them to help. You have talks of allyship. As Francis said, like, social media has been a blessing on one end and then not so much on the other. And you have people who are saying they want to create change, and how can I create change? So it's a little hard, because that, would you say, 3 steps back or forward, 1 step back? Like, it's just spinning your wheels and not getting anywhere. Exactly, right?
Now, in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's report, they were very clear and very precise in the wording that they used, right? They said something along the lines of, Canada has committed a cultural genocide. And this is the first time that this has been used in any sort of Canadian document or official report. Is that a fair statement? Has Canada committed a cultural genocide? And if that is a fair statement, is it fair to just classify that cultural genocide against missing and murdered Indigenous women? Could we broaden that to all Indigenous people?
Right. So the TRC mentions cultural genocide, and then with this coming out, the National Inquiry, and in the report also stating genocide, yes, 100%. I don't know how anyone can look at the findings from the report and see otherwise. I don't even know how you can open up media, the news, and not see it. Okay, but the report itself, to read that and to see it in there, it is clear as anything. I remember when when family members read the final report. Unfortunately, it was you're reading it, and it's all things that you knew, but it just kind of comes at you all at once. And there's no question.
Yeah.
Like I don't even know how to answer, because there's literally no question about it whatsoever.
How about for you, Francis? Is it fair to extend the use of the term cultural genocide, or should we even qualify genocide with the use culture? Is this just a flat out genocide?
It's a bit of both, honestly. You could make arguments for both. I think when the TRC report was released, and then the follow-up report for missing and murdered Indigenous women, again, folks had a bigger problem with the word genocide than the actual genocide itself. So online, especially, and in some in-person conversations I had as well, I was defending the use of that word and saying, look, I don't have my language. I'm not on my territory. Here's why. I personally know so many families that have been affected by missing and murdered Indigenous women, have been displaced from their communities. I worked in mental health for a number of years with Indigenous youth, and they're the ones that are paying, the ultimate price for a lot of this. So I don't want to debate the use of the word or the word at all. I want to dig down and talk about the genocide itself, and how can we stop it? How can we stop perpetuating the same thing over and over again, right? We no longer have the residential school system or the 60 scoop, but we have so many children in care.
The millennial scoop.
We're just transferring those issues. What we need to do is stop them, and we have to have some really real conversations before we can get there. And hopefully, conversations like this help folks get on board and really understand. We can't keep repeating the same situations over and over again and expect a different outcome.
Now, for you, Skylar, same thing. I mean, is this a genocide? The removal of lands for Indigenous people? I think you perfectly described that our communities, First Nations communities, Indigenous communities in general, are the only communities that their land base is getting smaller. As a resident of Niagara, we're continuously expanding, right? New hospitals all the time. New buildings all the time, right? This just seems to be a natural occurrence for people who live in urban settings. But for Indigenous people, I mean, Skylar, you're on the front lines right now. The wood in the building that you're in was constructed by your hands, right? Is it fair? Is it fair to say that it is a genocide?
Absolutely, it is. And I mean, I think that dispossession of lands, I think crafting the legal structures of, whether we're talking about injunctions and whether or not that in itself is perpetuating that genocide. Absolutely, it's genocide. I think that this is something that dispossessing Indigenous people from their lands is something that it strikes at the heart of what, who we are as people. And I think when we're talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women and trying to end anti-Indigenous racism, to try and put an end to all of those issues, like for a lot of us, that dispossession of lands means that our people have to go, that we don't have space to grow on the reserve. So we have to move into the cities. We have to go into, cultures that we aren't and haven't been exposed to before. And I know for me, having had to do that when I was in my teenage years, my early 20s, I absolutely had no idea what that was. And so seeing our people go into those cities with, alcoholism, drug addiction, and, being part of that, that picture that, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, this is something that our people are faced to deal with. And a lot of it relates back to the land. if we had those lands to be able to build and grow and thrive, our communities wouldn't be dispersed across all of these big cities. We wouldn't be, find ourselves in places where, that only bit of comfort is found in a bottle or drugs or whatever. And so, absolutely, I think that dispossession of lands is something that is still perpetuating those, centuries old dynamics of that genocide that we're talking about.
Now we find ourselves in a unique position because for the first time, I want to say in Canadian history, there is this apparent road to reconciliation, and I don't want to make this a come across as like this is anti our current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau or anti-liberal for that matter. But for the first time in history, we have this roadmap to reconciliation, and it doesn't seem as if the government is implementing it to the best of their abilities. Example being the boil water advisories that currently exist on communities like Six Nations, on my community of Curve Lake First Nations, on our traditional opening James Jauna's community of Wakumekong. What do you say to that? Because when you talk about 2 steps forward, 1 step back, it's fantastic that these reports are commissioned. It really is, because it highlights everything that we know, that we inherently know, and it validates our lived experiences. But very much like Fallon was saying, if you've made me go through this process and you're not going to do anything with it, what is the point? So I don't know what my question is. But what I want to know is just like talk about that for me. I mean, we have the roadmap. How can we move forward? We'll start with Francis.
For me, I think there's a couple reasons that we aren't moving forward. And for anyone out there that wants a good bedside read, or it's my bedside read, the Yellowhead Institute did a really great paper on where we're at with the TRC recommendations. And we are this past year, we saw movement in only 9 of those recommendations, which is actually down 1 from the previous year. This is not a new report. It's been around for quite a few years. We should be seeing more progress. And for me, the lack of progress really comes from a lack of accountability. And it's something that, I speak about quite often is for folks that aren't in Indigenous communities, when we introduce ourselves, we say, who we are, where we're from. We have, our names and our clans, and essentially that's a direct line back to our aunties and our uncles and our community that will hold us accountable for the things that we do and say. Where is that in Western society? Where is it? It doesn't exist. When you try to hold folks accountable, especially in Western society, it ends up being messy. Is the only way that I can truly put it. We're being told that we're attacking, that we're never happy, that nothing's ever good enough. And I just want to hold the Prime Minister or any level of government, whether it be municipal, provincial, federal, accountable. If they make promises, I expect that they will do everything in their power to keep them. And if they're not doing so, well, then that's an issue. And folks that are in those political parties, I expect them to take issue with it.
Now, I don't know that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission officially addresses the very concept of land back movements. But Skylar, what do you have to say around that?
I think I really would just echo a lot of the same things that Francis just said. But I mean, like, it is one of the women from our community today went into Caledonia to grab groceries, or I can't remember, went to go get lunch. And the OPP pulled her over, ran her plates, and pulled her over. And she was arrested for simply coming onto the land here. Simply coming here. Not for blockading a road, not for, helping to do any of that work or anything. She was arrested simply for coming here. And so whether you're talking about, Carl Dockstader, whether you're talking about Starla, who was here doing reporting, whether, any of the other people who were arrested for coming here simply for bringing food or coming to watch a concert or any of the other number of things. And now here we are 8 months later, seeing all of those charges, like the one against Carl, the ones against, I think there's about 15 other ones that are just being dropped. But the work has been done for them, right? All of that persuasion that the OPP have used to make sure that people don't come here. That make sure that, people are, or at least they're afraid to come here, because there's still a ton of people that come here. But that it is that bit of fear that the police are using in order to try and push that agenda forward, to continue that tactic. And Ottawa isn't so far away that if they were crawling, they'd have been here by now. 8 months later now, and we're still in the same spot that we were on July 19th.
Now, Fallon, I want to ask you the same question, but before I do, one of the things that I was realizing or paying attention to, Skylar, during the whole court process is the very concept of injunctions existing within the township of Caledonia. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, and please feel free to do so. But to my knowledge, should a person who has been formally charged with a crime, who in connection to 1492 Landback Lane, should they make the decision to go into Caledonia without a specific person, they would be considered in violation of an injunction.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I mean, and it's not just, it's the roads. And so there is an injunction on every single road in Haldimand County right now. There's not one single road that an Indigenous person can't have a flat tire on. If they are impeding traffic while they are changing that flat tire, they are now violating that injunction.
So my question then is, so like hypothetically speaking, myself or maybe my cousins who may not be formally affiliated with a 1492 Landback Lane movement, should I find myself in the unfortunate position where my car did run into a flat tire or something to that effect, would it be fair to assume that I would be charged?
I mean, I don't know. It would probably depend on the cop that was attending the scene, but absolutely, you would be violating that injunction simply for being on that road and impeding traffic in any kind of way, regardless of whether or not that was a flat tire. It doesn't specify in that injunction whether or not it is due to a flat tire or land defense stuff. And so absolutely, you could certainly be held in as violating a court order.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Skylar. Fallon, same topic about the, oh my goodness, I'm having a brain fart. About the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and the progress that has been made. That is, again, Justin Trudeau, our current prime minister, is the first leader of this country who seems to have a roadmap to make or establish positive relationships with Indigenous people, but that doesn't seem to be the case in this regard. Do you have any just general comments about that?
I think I kind of said, I mean, I'm not going to say it's just like you said already, like anything specific against Justin Trudeau or the Liberals, because quite frankly, it's a system.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what people have to kind of remember is it's a system. There's going to be promises made. They have been made in the past. They'll continue to be made. So I think, like, for instance, for the National Inquiry, like, that came about from grassroots organization. It wasn't because of, you know, the necessarily the TRC or the government. Like, we have to remember, it's families. It's like, look what Skylar's doing. It's people on the ground. That's what is bringing the change. Like, you know, these, as Francis said, these conversations, bringing more awareness, educating from Indigenous people's perspective, instead of such, you know, politically driven agendas, essentially, you know, because that's I feel like that's where we're at, where we need to start to continue to do the work. Has there been change? Yeah. But is it enough? Is it something that we can see necessarily? Not in all aspects, but we're a long ways away from where we deserve to be.
One of the things that I like to say is that while change is happening, what makes it appropriate or not is the rate of change in which it's happening, right? So if we were to look back at the Waterton and the boil and the water situation that happened then, and the boil water advisory that's happening now, right? That rate of change is what leads to that discrimination. They were able to, unfortunately, rally around a community and make concrete changes to improve the water quality there. People were charged, so on and so forth, and the whole investigation was done. But when it comes to Indigenous communities, what we're seeing is that Justin Trudeau's been in for his second term now, and still that boil water advisory still exists. The very concept of that list still exists. And I like what you said, Fallon, about the systems. And that brings me up to my next point is the systemic racism that exists. While Justin Trudeau might not be a racist, he works within a system that perpetuates systemic racism. I think a very good example of systemic racism that exists is the Indian Act. We are the only group of people within the society or the country of Canada that is governed by a very specific legislation. But yet we still hear all the time that systemic racism doesn't exist. From Niagara. So I know, Fallon, there was this lovely article that was recently put out about speaking against systemic racism, and how can you know what it is if you can't really define it? And Senator Murray Sinclair was very, very clear on the definition of systemic racism. So I guess just a general question is, systemic racism does exist. Is that a fair statement to say, Skylar?
I think absolutely, and I mean, I think that's something that we deal with the civil case, and seeing this old white guy in Haldimand County, Ontario, who just happened to have a judgeship that, you know, had absolutely no idea where Six Nations was or what rights we had to the land, and wouldn't even hear from the people that were being dispossessed by his court order that seen a permanent injunction on October 22nd that again forced the OPP to come in and brutalize our people, to shoot at our people. A guy got shot in the back with a rubber bullet. I mean, this is the outcome of not dealing with that systemic racism. You know, if we aren't, you know, stopping that systemic racism within those courts, whether you're talking about Gladue stuff that sees, you know, a third of the population of every women's prison in the country filled with our people, you know, when we make up 3 or 4% of it. Like, this is absolutely ridiculous. You know, this is absolutely ridiculous. And so if we're talking about, you know, all of the stuff around Gladue and, you know, the TRC stuff and the missing and murdered Indigenous women stuff, the Ipperwash inquiry, all of these reports, all of these studies, all of the academia that has gone into studying all of these things that of how Indigenous people have gotten nothing but screwed over the last ever since contact. And here we are, you know, 8 months into this, with a very peaceful roadmap laid out for us to be able to find a peaceful resolution here. If not for the systemic racism that is built into legislation, that is built into these courts, that is built into those policing structures. You know, whether you want to talk about defund the police stuff around, you know, the over and under policing of Indigenous issues. You know, like we are over policed when it comes to us standing up for our rights. When we see, you know, 200 OPP officers descend on 9 people in the middle of a field. But when one of our women is taken from our community, one of our women is murdered in our communities, in those cities, when one of our people are killed, we see no action whatsoever, you know, or very little, or aren't looked after in the same way that we've seen. You know, you highlighted the Walkerton water stuff. Like Six Nations has, you know, half of our community has to boil their water. That can't drink the water from their taps. And this is absolutely ridiculous and infuriating to so many, that we keep on going through this over and over and over again, that we have to have these conversations over and over and over again, because people just aren't listening, whether that's government at the federal or provincial level, and even in the municipalities, to see these mayors like Ken Hewitt here in Caledonia call the people that were peacefully occupying these lands terrorists. You know, that called for the targeting of my family, and congratulating the OPP on targeting my wife at the time. Like, this is absolutely infuriating. So it is really, really difficult to try and, you know, sum up in some nice way to be that nice little Indian, when all of this stuff that they keep on saying that they're going to change, and all of these pretty words that they keep on saying to us, like, they're just not making the change that they're saying that they're going to be making.
And when Mo was speaking, Francis, he referenced what was happening, or what just happened with the RCMP's report, and we talked about the Colton Bushy case, and the commissioner Brenda Lucki has come out and said that systemic racism doesn't exist. Or my apologies. She came out and saying that systemic racism doesn't exist, and then shortly thereafter, she kind of backtracked on her words and kind of fumbled a bit when it came to her providing examples of what is systemic racism. We can unequivocally say right now that systemic racism exists in policing, right? Whether it be the RCMP, whether it be the OPP, whether it be regional police, so on and so forth. Would you say that that's a fair statement? Oh,
Absolutely, unquestionably. I think anyone who says that, you know, racism doesn't exist in the RCMP does not know why the RCMP exists at all. You don't know your own history, and you know, I think it's time we dive into that. I think we see, or I've experienced racism in pretty much every facet of my life, in the education system, in the medical system. You know, it's there, and I don't want to debate that it does or doesn't exist, because it's incredibly frustrating. You know, I think about the Colton Bushy case, and, you know, Tina Fontaine. They happened so close together. You know, my friend group at that time, you know, our group chat was a place where we supported each other because we weren't getting it elsewhere, that we were sharing our reactions. You know, when the results of the Colton Bushy case and Gerald Stanley's sentence was announced, I was so moved that I was sick to my stomach. You know, and the conversations and the justifications afterwards were really hard to stomach. I think what folks really need to understand is, when you debate things that affect someone else more than it affects you, you need to remember that it takes a greater emotional toll on them, and it will likely elicit a more emotional response when you play the devil's advocate. Okay. You're making that individual who's likely speaking from a place of personal experience have to defend themselves against an oppressive opinion or system that you're really just too embarrassed to admit that you believe. Because let's be honest, if you didn't believe it, why would you argue it? Why do you feel compelled to play that devil's advocate? For you, it might be an academic exercise, but for us, it feels like reliving pain only to be, dismissed. My heart goes out to Fallen because I could hear her voice, and that has been my voice many times in talking about personal experiences. We don't want to have our experiences dismissed. We don't want our humanity dismissed. The fact that you can remain calm under circumstances is really your privilege at play. It's not you being objective. Folks need to learn how to be humble. Listen to us when we speak, and listen to hear. Please don't listen to respond. I think that's something that a lot of folks really need to learn how to do. I think it's important to note that we shouldn't be seeking a middle ground when it comes to racial politics. That is a sign of white entitlement. There is no middle ground at all. All the ground between racism and racial injustice is racism. It's a varying line or spectrum, but it's still all racism. The middle ground is where folks pretend to be anti-racist, but still ensure the survival of racism because they're afraid to move out of that comfort zone.
Well, one of the things that we're seeing in the province of Quebec, Fallon, is the existence of systemic racism within the healthcare, and most recently, it's affected Indigenous women to the point where a woman, in order for her to get any sort of treatment, had to live stream on Facebook for there to be any accountability to be held. Healthcare in the country of Canada has notoriously been used to target Indigenous people through and through. Do you have any comments about systemic racism within the healthcare system itself?
Well, for my family specifically, the fact that we didn't receive proper post-traumatic care speaks for itself. My older brother at the age of 21 committed suicide. So that is, sorry, I was 21, he was 29. That is directly an impact of our family not receiving proper health care from our family or from our government. A lot of the calls for justice are around healthcare, just simple basic needs, the just basic healthcare being provided in a culturally safe, in a way that speaks to Indigenous people, not necessarily the umbrella of all Canadians, because it looks differently for all cultures, to be inclusive of that. And we're a long ways away from that. Specifically, I really want to hop on what you were saying about the RCMP and the systemic racism there. It goes without a doubt, like Francis said. However, it goes into further into our justice system. The judge for my family's case went as far as to blame our community members for my parents' death. They should have stepped up. He's quoted saying, in stopping what had happened, the RCMP themselves, as I mentioned, didn't listen to our family's cries for help. And an RCMP officer, because our case did go into an inquiry, one of the officers actually said that my mother was the only one who knew the grave danger that she was in, and that she should have basically had done more. She got a restraining order. She made several complaints to the RCMP. And then to touch on healthcare a little more, and intertwine it with, because it is all systems across the board, the RCMP with my brother. My brother was actually questioned at the age of 17 while we were held hostage, with no adult, just him, as to what was happening at my parents' home. So right there, that the proper healthcare was not there for him to support him in what he was actually in the middle of. So yeah, as you mentioned, the Quebec case, we're a long ways away. That was just this past year, so.
Yeah, I can't believe that these are still topics that we're having to deal with, systems that we're having to constantly evaluate and constantly have to scrutinize. When we look to these systems that should be here to support what, like, as an example, because I'm half Indigenous, right? I'm half First Nation, so my dad is Dutch. But on the Dutch side, well, my cousins look to the policing system. They don't see what I see. When they look to the healthcare providers, they don't see what I see. And not to name out, not to call out police officers, the systems of policing and the systems of healthcare and the systems of democracy, they don't have that same experience that we have. I want to take the time to thank you all just quickly for your presentation. This brings an end to the formal questions, and what we're going to do right now is to the listeners and to the viewers. I forget that I'm not on radio and this is live, and sometimes I let my double chin go. I apologize for that. Need to look all skinny on air. To the people watching, if you want, take the time to text in, not text, type in the comments your questions, and we will bring them up now. So if we could, the first question, please. Most effective strategies that facilitate action of change, from La Nokomis. Ellie Nokomis? La Nokomis? I'm not sure, but Grandma something. The most effective strategies that facilitate action for change. Skylar, in your opinion, somebody who is doing direct action, what is the most effective strategy?
You know what? I mean, I think it's a question of capacity. If people have the capacity for me and my family, like we were able to have this discussion and come together to decide whether or not we had the capacity to give these last, 8 months plus to do this work. And you know what? We came back to to have those discussions over and over again before we did anything here. And I think for some people, that capacity is, supporting these kinds of movements. For some people, that's donating $20 to the GoFundMe, or the, bringing down a casserole one night, or, for other people, that means, coming to spend the day or the weekend, the week, the month. For some folks like myself and a few others that have, made this home for the last eight months, like this has been what it takes. And so if we want to see that change, certainly when it comes to land claims issues, this is something we need to do.
And for Francis, as an educator and somebody who frequently does presentations, you referenced earlier on in the presentation humanizing Indigenous people. What would you say the most effective strategy for change is?
Education. But not just education, early education, I think, is the other thing. My first memory of anti-Indigenous racism, I was 5. I distinctly remember someone telling my mother not to let me get too dark in the summer. And I didn't quite understand it then, but I remember feeling so incredibly uncomfortable with it. But as I grew, it became a thing and something that I heard more and more often. And, as I grew, it clicked why. My son is 15. 15 going on 30 in some ways, but he's really just 15. He was 5 when he was bullied to the point that I came up the stairs one day and he's standing in the bathroom with a pair of scissors to his hair, and he's cutting off his hair because he's being bullied for it, and he's being relentlessly picked on. And I think that's why it's so important to start those conversations really early and in an age appropriate way. After all, if our children, as racialized children, can experience racism as young as 5, non-Indigenous youth can learn about that racism again in an age appropriate way. It's easier to build on these conversations over the years, which is why I really love working with youth. I work with the London District Catholic School Board. I've worked with youth in various different capacities. We're opening Nawashnagong, which is a Indigenous-led childcare and family center here in London, and I worked with We Matter for a few years. By starting those conversations young, we end up with more knowledgeable and empathetic adults that you don't have to do quite as much legwork to get them to unlearn and relearn the knowledge that they know, like that's out there. I think a lot of adults are really stuck on that. Well, this is what I was taught. This is what I know. This is what I've seen. And if they can't address the fact, well, what you have been taught is problematic because it only comes from one viewpoint. It's largely whitewashed. Media still uses outdated terms to refer to us, still uses outdated language or inappropriate language, pan-indigenizes us. So for me, the answer is always going to be education, but education and giving folks the tools to move past just, I'm listening, I'm learning. What are you going to do with that information once you have it? And like Skylar said, once you have that information, folks can act in various different ways. Sometimes it is uplifting Indigenous folks, their voices. Sometimes it's donating directly to the cause, but it can be as simple as, talking to your racist uncle and being like, hey, that's not okay. Right? Like, it doesn't have to be these huge grand gestures. Small stepping stones will get us somewhere.
And for Fallon, same question, is effective strategies that we could use to create that change, that profound change. And as somebody who's participated in a national inquiry, somebody who has gone through that formal process that the government has prescribed, what do you think the most effective way for us to create change is?
One, I always say, I heard this from someone, this is not mine, around the dinner table. Number one, having those conversations, Francis said, with specifically family, friends. Those difficult conversations are where that uncomfortableness is where change will happen. Specifically with the calls for justice, calling in friends, family, local governments, having those conversations, asking for MMIW, for the calls for justice to be implemented, speaking to families, but in a way that you're not seeking to be educated, showing up to events like this to hear and not necessarily be a part of the conversation, just to listen. For myself, just being a part of the inquiry and hearing other families, listening to the testimonies, there was change in that for me. So I could just imagine how much that can impact others. And it's small steps, as we've seen throughout history. very small, slow steps, but it can happen. And I say quite often, like, I like to make people feel uncomfortable when I'm talking, because it's going to maybe have a ripple effect that will go through them to other people. I want them to talk about me. I do. I want them to, because I think that's where change will happen.
I'm of the same opinion. It's about making that emotional connection, right? Oftentimes, or not oftentimes, society has done a fantastic job at othering Indigenous people, or labeling, as Francis said, Indigenous people as people of the past, not recognizing that we live in your communities. I live in the city of St. Catharines. Francis, you live in the city of London, and Fallon, I believe you're at Niagara somewhere, and Skylar, you frequent Caledonia and surrounding cities all of the time. But to remind them that we are here and that we do exist, and that when you're walking down that street, there's a high probability that you're going to run into myself or people from our respective backgrounds. I believe that there is one more question from the audience, and it's directed towards the one and only Fallon. So Fallon, for folks organizing on the front lines right now for the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, too spirited, what would you say from your site within orgs that have developed over the last few years would be the most important demands to directly push with our actions? Because beyond saying 231 calls for justice, what would we be stating as the most important issues to be addressed and changed, implemented immediately? Who can we network with to pick up the threads that orgs are currently working with? And by 231, apparently I can't read them. That's supposed to say 231 calls for justice. I'm working on it.
I can't read the last part. It says currently working on for Facebook.
Yeah, there's I'm going to imagine that there's a Facebook post.
Okay.
Yeah, I get to see what you get to see.
Oh, okay. All right. So for me, I've been talking, just sharing my story, and so specifically with local governments, I've been able to meet with people to try and get the closer to our community for change. If you were to read the final report and you read the calls for justice, it's very simple to see that overall racism, we have to call it out. It has to stop. It's embedded in every single thing, all the issues. It's woven through each of the calls for justice. So if there's one stepping point, it's this type of conversation, exactly what we're doing here. We have to denounce racism. We have to call it out. It has to stop. I'm going to say it again. It's within all of the systems. It's embedded in there. So like, is it an easy answer as to like, what's the first step? No, because there's going to be lots of ways that you can come at it. So I don't know how well I did at answering that exactly. Yeah.
No, I think you did a fantastic job, and if I could bring up the words of Dr. Ibram Kendi, in order to be, there's no such thing as being not racist. We need to be actively pursuing an anti-racist mentality. That for us sitting by when our racist uncle at the dinner table makes these comments, you have one of two choices. You either say something and be an anti-racist, or you do nothing, which makes you complicit in acts of racism, right? And one of the major points that he attempts to make is that we need to reprogram our minds to focus on these subtle acts of racism, because that is the only true way to combat it. Sometimes when people hear the term racist, they view it as a mountain, and that mountain to become not a racist is too big to climb. So it starts with these individual footsteps, right? You call out your racist uncle now, then you call out your racist cousin the next day, and then you start calling it out at the workplace. And when you call it out at the workplace, what you're doing is you're making the environment a lot easier to work with for other people who are racialized. One of the things that we do or did on One Dish, One Mic is the traveling thought. And this was a lovely idea brought up by my co-host and my bestie, Carl Dockstader, who unfortunately could not be here today because Carl is a man of many talents, and one of those talents that he has is the current leader of the Niagara Regional Native Center in the form of executive director. So sadly, he could not join us here, but the traveling thought essentially is your elevator pitch. If you had to do an elevator pitch, talk about your topic that you have brought up and leave some of our listeners, some of our viewers with the key points of your topic. So when it comes to Landback Lane, Skylar, if you can drive home the point of Landback Lane, you have 45 seconds to do so.
You know what? If people are interested in getting involved in anything, whether it's missing and murdered Indigenous women or the land back movement, we need to really start to push, and we need to push that at all levels, whether that's at the federal level within government or the province, within your municipality. What are we doing in terms of reconciliation? I think that idea that we are all treaty people, regardless of whether you are a politician or you are, for me, I'm an iron worker. I do structural steel for a living, and for us as people that aren't elected officials or hereditary chiefs to be able to have a say in the goings on of our lands and of our people, that relationship that we have with each other, that you have that same obligation as a white settler as those governments do, that you are as much responsible for upholding those treaties and keeping up on those relationships that go back, hundreds of years. And so my call is to those settler allies that, it's time to start doing some work to hold your governments accountable. But at the same time, we need to be holding our families accountable for upholding those relationships.
Fallon, missing and murdered Indigenous women. What do our audience members need to know? Your traveling thought, please.
I had an elder say this, and I shared it before, and I'll continue sharing it because the knowledge that they shared, it impacted me so much. You can't unhear what you heard today. You can't unhear my story, my family story. You can't unhear what Skylar is fighting for and Francis. So what are you going to do about it now? There are women, Indigenous women, girls going missing in this country still. It's not a thing of the past. The numbers in the final report are only numbers that were documented. There's many cases that weren't. Also, remember when you're reading that, there are also cases that were the RCMP were not. They were unwilling to help with parts of the final report. So I want you, when you're reading it, to know it's a thing of now. It's not a thing of the past. Read the final report. Go to the website. I would put it in the chat, but my chat won't reach all of you guys. So it's www.mmywg-ffada.org. The final report is there. The calls for justice are there. Call on our government, specifically call on your local government. That's where it'll start to hopefully ripple up throughout our country. And as Canadians, you can start with reading Section 15 of the Calls for Justice. There are calls for justice that are laid out there for every Canadian. If you're an educator, there's a section that you could specifically read. If you are in healthcare, if you're in the police force, the justice system, read them and share the final report. Talk to people about it. Bring attention to it because it's happening now. You're muted, Sean.
Sorry, thank you so much. I appreciate your words, Fallon. Francis, final thought, traveling thought, 45 seconds. What do people need to know about anti-Indigenous racism?
I think it's important to recognize that while we're affected by anti-Indigenous racism, of course we feel it more deeply and we're impacted more adversely. But if as a non-Indigenous person, you don't think that you're impacted, I'm here to tell you that you're wrong. Anti-Indigenous racism stifles Indigenous ways of knowing and being, which means that many of you are simply missing out on the amazing wealth of knowledge our communities and peoples possess, the richness of our culture, and just so much more. And let's be honest, a lot of the colonial systems imposed really aren't doing many of you any favors at all, as they tend to favor a singular demographic. With all of that being said, I think something that we want to look at is relationships. Now, what I'm saying is not that you need to develop relationships with Indigenous folks and exhaust them with your questions, because that's completely the opposite of what I'm saying. However, in my experience, when non-Indigenous folks start building those relationships, we're suddenly more humanized and they become more invested in the work that needs to get done. And this goes for your personal lives, but also your professional lives and on a societal level. Essentially, if you run in circles that aren't diverse, you'll never know how impacted communities are affected by policies, politics, and power imbalances. So build relationships with those Indigenous folks in your community where you live.
Thank you. Sorry, my apologies. I'm still learning how to use this technology. It's been a rough day for me when it comes to technology. So I want to take the time to thank all of you. I want to say thank you, Chimagwech, to Francis, to Skylar, and to Fallon for coming on. I want to thank the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for partnering up with One Dish One Mic to bring you this broadcast. And more specifically, I want to thank Manulife for taking the time and sponsoring an event that highlights issues that affect Indigenous people. Without the support of Manulife, this broadcast would not have been brought forward to you and to your attention. We are going right now we are going to bring up the one and only James Jauna from Wakwamacong and Adawa Potawatomi to do our closing.
Nahau, miigwech, kinuya, ani kinuya. Okay, thank you, everyone. Hello, everyone. Anishinaabe Dao. I am Anishinaabe from Minising, Manitoulin Island. Wikwem Kung, Shnakade, Shkunagan Ethnisia. Wikwamacong Reservation is where I'm from, unceded Indian Reservation. Bati not entkamagak ataing yang. There is a lot of things that are happening around us. Bati nok wom the zina enneming mina e awing. A lot of people don't see our thoughts and who we are. Yeah, but go get a ganjweb no go, man. We are still being pushed. Can't go to go somewhere else. We were Nagadoeniming, Gayaming, we were Nagadeniming, Oyaming to take care of what we had and to take care of what we're gonna have. Kime, Manpiki Ametam, we were here first. Snugget Nunga, it's very difficult today. We must say in Kita Adzawin to walk your culture. Snugget is very difficult. But the queen must go z. You yourself have to be strong. But the queen must go wendem. You have to have a strong mind. To be skogana nin eshitchen, for example, of what I do. The Akanumagen Kadanawewin I teach our sound, which is Anishinaabe Moen. Nokonomok Benochiak, I teach children. Nokonomok Nenokmenakwelk, I teach men and women. Washer Ginamort Nishnaabe Mek how to read it, or Shigigidort how to speak it, and eventually we watch it to have a conversation and visit each other in the Anishinaabe language. It's a big dream because Nin Dao Nintam I'm the first generation of a residential school survivor. That's my dad. And my mom, she always spoke the language at home. Her English was so bad she couldn't hardly speak English. But I'm thankful for my dad for keeping up the language while he was in residential school. He was put in the hole a lot of times. I've been told by other elders that were in residential school with him. So Miigwech Dana knows. I say thank you to him. Meanwhile, in that opening that I did, it says, Nada motion, je mino wa mak mina nak ni jipimadas. Help me look at my fellow human and talk to my fellow human life in a good way. In that opening that I did, that's what it says, and it's very true. And then we do our offering of sema, of tobacco. Wabunung east, Jaunung south, Epingishmuk west, Giwet nung north. Miwe atang akenake. That's all around the earth. Minuanga kit, Mondanga kit, I'll say this. Nagadwen medik, take care of each other. Nagadwen mon and Eminashkatamik, take care of what you're going after. The Kendagot Gishpin Japsek, the Madzun Ebet Temgak, it will show that it went through the fellow life that is coming. Miwe, Gukit, Nishin, it's good, and Nakiek, what you are doing. Nishin, Kenjagadek, Ejwebok, it's good to know what is happening. Eja, Nakuik, how you guys challenge Kinegego, everything. Miigwech Dindim, I say thank you to you guys. Miigwech Sean Giikmin, and thank you, Sean, for inviting me. We began to speak with Saknegia to do an opening. Mina we do a closing. Miigwech Dindim, I say thank you to all of you. Nagadwen Medic, all take care of yourselves. Now, Miigwech, thank you.
Miigwech, James, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming on. If everybody else is here, if not, it's just me. Ladies and gentlemen, there we are, being joined by the ones and onlys, the Francis, the Skylers, the Fallons. We say thank you. We say Chimiigwech. We say Nawagoa. From us to you for taking the time to participate in tonight's event. If we could maybe just pop up the socials, if that's possible, Mike, real quick. If not, that's completely okay. Reach out to us at your convenience. You can reach out to Fallon at and Mo at and Francis at and Skylar at. Beautiful. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. It was an absolute pleasure. I wish you well. Bamapi.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.